My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
They returned to Tahrir Square, thousands of Egyptians, to chant the same chant of the revolution. People want the downfall of the regime.
I just wanted to start this video by saying hello and thank you to the Most Amazing Top 10 family and everyone who's tuning into this video. Most Amazing Top 10 participated in Blackout Tuesday, and the reception from the audience was so amazing that I wanted to say we are really appreciative of all of you. Many of you donated to the NAACP and Black Lives Matter fund that was connected to the video. Now moving forward, it felt strange to go back into our regular content with everything that is going on in the world. That doesn't mean that we will never bring you scary themed content again, but for this video I wanted to focus on something that could help educate people on what could be made possible with this movement. We are still going to bring it to you in a top 10 fashion because that is what we do best. I'm your host Jay Dorena, and for this video, instead of liking, commenting, or subscribing, I would love it if you could go check out the Blackout Tuesday fundraiser and donate, even if it's only $1. The link will be in the description. And I wanted to say that this list is not a competition of which protest was more important, it's just to inform. And now I would like to educate you on some powerful protests. At number 10 we have the ALEXANDERPLATZ demonstration. In the late 80s, Germany was in great turmoil. The country was split in two. There was East and West Germany, the West being a more free liberal nation with a healthy system of democracy, and the East being controlled by a communist rule. By 1989, people who lived in East Germany were finding ways to flee to West Germany through Hungary. There were protests breaking out all over the country, and in October of 1989, 300,000 people showed up in the city of Leipzig to protest for political reform. A month after that, somewhere around 750,000 people marched to the Berlin Wall in East Germany and protested once again for political reform. Within a few days, the communist regime was broken, and there was an order to tear down the Berlin Wall. Coming in at number 9, we have the Boston Tea Party. When America was still under British rule, colonial Americans were starting to get fed up with the British influence. They wanted to have control of their own country. That's when the British passed the Tea Act. This would force the soon-to-be Americans to pay a huge amount of money to the British Parliament for the tea trade. Colonials did not want this at all. They wanted a country where they could be taxed by their own government. So as a protest, a group of colonials snuck onto British ships in the Boston Harbor, and they started to throw crates of tea that were on board the ships into the ocean. This was over $1 million in lost revenue, but it was a very important moment in American history because it led to the American Revolution. Coming in at number 8, we have the suffragettes movement. The suffrage movement was started in 1903, and the focus was voting rights for women, but a larger picture was to bring more equality to women in America. The suffragettes protested hard. They would go on marches, they would harass and heckle politicians, and they would even burn down election booths and chain themselves to buildings to show solidarity. This was met with heavy resistance from the public and the government. This type of behavior was unheard of, and many of them were quickly arrested. But when they arrested, they didn't stop the movement. While in prison, they would go on hunger strikes, which led to even more cruel treatment when they were forced fed. They kept fighting, and it wasn't until after World War I where women over 30 were now allowed to vote. And then 10 years later, it was made that women 21 years of age could vote. Coming in at number 7, we have the Stonewall riots. It was the summer of '69, and gay people throughout America were being treated horribly. Gay sex was actually illegal as it would break archaic sodomy laws. There were few places in the country where gay people could go to feel accepted and not be under attack from the public and the police. One of these places was the Stonewall Inn in New York City. This was a somewhat safe haven for gay and trans men. And when I say somewhat, I mean the cops would still come in and arrest and harass and attack people for just being of a different sexual orientation. Well, on June 28th, the cops attempted to raid the Stonewall Inn, and they were met with heavy resistance. The patrons fought back against the police and attacked them. This led to massive riots outside the inn and the police locking themselves in the Stonewall Inn. The rioters then lit the inn on fire, and the police escaped in fear. The riots went on for another 3 days, and this led to the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, who fought for gay equality. Coming at number 6, we have the Orange Revolution. In 2004, there was a Ukrainian election. The elected official was Viktor Yanukovych, but this didn't sit well with the public. Viktor was a Kremlin supporter, and there was a tidal wave of evidence that suggested he had tampered with votes and in some areas intimidated or blackmailed voters to vote for him. The people would not have this. They knew that the pro-democratic leader, Viktor Yushchenko, was the right candidate, so they took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest. For over a week straight, they protested to have a re-election, and eventually the parliament voted in the way of the people. This led to Yushchenko, the Democratic candidate, winning with over 9% more of the votes. The people refused to be lied to, and through this they got a fair election. It wasn't all easy though. Even though Yushchenko won, he was mysteriously poisoned. There's a lot of evidence that shows this was most likely the Russian government trying to kill him so they could have control of the Ukraine. Coming in at number 5, we have the stay-at-home protest. In the year 1950 in South Africa, apartheid law was brutal and forced millions of black people to live as second-class citizens. The government wanted to make sure that they could continue their stranglehold on black Africans, and they passed a law that would allow either police, government officials, or both to investigate and even stop any organization or political party. This was basically put in place to make sure black people couldn't congregate and come up with ways to fight for their own rights. Well, so they fought for their rights. They stayed at home. Hundreds of thousands of black South Africans stayed at home and boycotted work and white businesses to force the government to see them. If you want to make them listen, hit them in their wallets. Coming in at number 4, we have the Tahrir Square protests.
During the revolution, many like Mahmoud paid with their lives in Tahrir Square. Hard-won gains that will keep Egyptians coming back as they fight to create what they believe is a real democracy.
In 2011, tensions were high in Egypt. They had had the same leader, Hosni Mubarak, for the past 30 years, and protesters came to the Tahrir Square to demand that he step down. But this wasn't without conflicts. For the first week, anti-Mubarak protests were met with pro-Mubarak supporters, and the two sides violently battled in the streets. They each beat each other, they threw flaming bottles of gas at each other, and they even fired bullets at each other. This went on for over a week, but eventually the numbers of anti-Mubarak protesters grew to the point where they filled up the square. At the peak of this protest, over 1 million people came out to support the cause of change. After 2.5 weeks of protesting, Mubarak had no choice and he was forced to step down from his position, and the people rejoiced. At number 3, we have the EDSA power revolution. Since the 70s, Filipino people had been oppressed by their government. Ferdinand Marcos was the leader of the Philippines and he refused to relinquish power. When the people would try to protest the government, they would be silenced and shot down in the streets. The civil unrest continued to build until 1986, when the people were pushed to the point of a snap election, so Marcos could prove to the people that he was still the desired official. There was also pressure from the US to hold this election to keep the Filipino people at ease. Not long before this election was meant to be held, the opposition leader was assassinated and his wife took his place. The election still went through and Marcos won, but it was very clear that Marcos had rigged the election, especially when 2 high-ranking military officials stepped down and called for Marcos' resignation. When word got out, people started to flood the streets to protest. 3 million Filipino people came out to fight for democracy. Marcos called tanks to come in and kill the protesters, and when the tanks arrived, they kneeled in front of the tanks, placed their hands upon them, and the tanks stopped. The soldiers refused to kill the protesters, and Marcos fled the country. A full revolution happened without a drop of blood. Coming in at number 2, we have the March on Montgomery. In March of 1965, Martin Luther King, along with several other members of the civil rights community, planned a march from Selma, Alabama to the capital Montgomery. This was a protest to display that all Americans, it doesn't matter if you're black or white, have the right to vote. The first attempt at this was met with harsh resistance from the Alabama governor. He sent riot police to stop them from marching. The police gassed and attacked the protesters. It was horrible. However, this caught attention of President Johnson, who spoke out before Congress about his support for the movement. Later that month, 3,200 people met in Selma to make the march happen again. The governor of Alabama was still against this display, but this time the protesters had support of the president, who federalized the National Guard to protect Martin Luther King and the other supporters of the civil rights movement as they walked. The trip was 52 miles and took 5 days, and by the time they made it to the end of this journey, they had 25,000 people walking with them. This display led to the Voters Act, which made it illegal for racial discrimination against voters. Coming in at number 1 is the March on Washington. August 28th in 1963 would be one of the most incredible days in American history. The way that black people were being treated in the southern states was finally reaching a level where leaders could no longer tolerate it, and John F. Kennedy was making a push to have new civil rights laws presented before Congress. This type of change was not an opportunity that could be passed up, so a march was planned to show how much Americans cared about the rights of black people. They were to march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. The numbers of supporters could have never been expected. Nearly 250,000 people showed up, all of different races and religions, because they saw what had to change. At the end of this march, several speakers took to the podium to talk to the people about why this movement meant so much and about how they had a chance right then and there to make America different. It was on this day that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. That march and Martin Luther King's speech greatly influenced the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voters Act.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
But that was nearly 60 years ago, and it's time to make some more progress. Alright everyone, I want to thank you so much for watching this content today. I hope you found it very helpful, and I hope it inspired you at home to know what positive change can come from standing up for what is right. There's a lot of injustice in the world, but if we come together, we can help stop injustice and bring equality. As I said before, we have started a fundraiser where all proceeds go to the NAACP and Black Lives Matter, and if you donate, please do, even if it's only $1. And if you can't do that, then you can watch some more educational content on protesting and discrimination. And if you don't even have time for that, just contact a person of color in your life and let them know that you love them and support them. I want to thank everyone for the Most Amazing Top 10 family for being so kind through all of this. Until next time, I've been your host, Jay Dorena, and Black Lives Matter.